sweet chaos lovers. I'm Penelope, not Garcia, babe. Penelope Garcia. Today's case is a cold case solved by Reddit detectives, so let's dive in.
Christina Skates thought she was just passing time. In 2014, the 23-year-old biology student was casually browsing through old cemetery records one quiet afternoon when something caught her attention. Line 82,483. On it was a date of death, February 5th, 1975. But instead of a name, it simply read, Unknown White Female Bones. Christina paused. She was puzzled. Someone had been murdered, buried without a name, and completely forgotten. As she later said, it stayed in the back of my mind for months. I kept thinking, this isn't right. This isn't how things should be. What Christina didn't know was that her curiosity would spark something much bigger, a chain reaction that would last years and reach across continents. Her simple question would rally strangers on the internet, uncover serious system failures, and eventually help solve a decades-old cold case that had baffled investigators for generations. This is a story of how one forgotten line in a cemetery record turned into a digital crusade to give a nameless victim her identity and her dignity back. Christina Skates had always been fascinated by mysteries hiding in plain sight. As a biology student at Cleveland State University, she spent her free time digging into family histories and piecing together stories across generations. But this wasn't just a hobby. Christina had developed real skills. She knew how to use advanced databases, analyze DNA, and cross-check records like a professional. Genealogy gave her something she loved, solving puzzles, connecting dots, and uncovering stories long forgotten. In online genealogy circles, she was known for her determination, her attention to detail, and her ability to find records others missed. But when she came across line 82483 in the cemetery records, something felt different. The entry seemed cold and routine, almost clinical. It simply read, Unknown White Female Bones. Most people would have scrolled past it. Christina didn't. What made this case personal was geography. The remains had been found just 20 minutes from Strongsville, the town where Christina grew up. This wasn't some faraway mystery. It happened in her backyard. Someone had been murdered, buried without a name, and completely forgotten, only miles from her childhood home. To understand how this happened, we need to go back to February 15th, 1975. That day, 3 teenage boys were exploring the Rocky River area in the Millstream Run Reservation when they stumbled upon human bones scattered in the winter brush. At first, they weren't sure what they'd found. Maybe they were afraid to tell anyone. But eventually, they called the police. When investigators arrived, they found more remains, but not a complete skeleton. The bones had been exposed to the elements for months and scattered by animals. Still, one chilling clue stood out. A .24 caliber bullet lodged in the left temple of the skull. On February 12, 1975, the death was ruled a homicide. The remains belonged to a young white woman, around 20 years old. But without a jawbone or most of the teeth, even estimating her age was difficult. Police tried everything they could in 1975, even comparing her skull to photos of Patty Hearst, the famous kidnapping victim making headlines at the time. But dental records didn't match. No missing persons cases fit. No one came forward to claim her. So, on May 15th, 1975, 3 months after she was found, her body was buried in an unmarked grave in the Potter's Field section of Memorial Garden Cemetery. No name, no headstone, no family. Just another unclaimed life laid to rest without answers. And for decades, that was the end of her story, until Christina saw the forgotten line in the ledger, Unknown White Female Bones. From that moment, someone was looking for her again. But by 2014, the case had been long forgotten. The files were collecting dust. Detectives had retired. The evidence was boxed away. This young woman had been erased from memory, existing only as a vague entry in a cemetery book. But Christina couldn't walk away. Her biology training had taught her to keep asking questions, especially when things didn't make sense. Her passion for genealogy had shown her how to chase leads and uncover connections. And her natural curiosity, what her friends jokingly called her inner detective, simply couldn't ignore someone who had been forgotten for so long. She had no idea that this small decision would lead to something much bigger, a chain reaction that would involve online communities, forensic artists, and even reveal serious flaws in the system. But she knew one thing: that unknown woman deserved her name back. Christina made the choice to act, and it would change everything. She began where any good researcher would, with the newspaper. She spent hours at local libraries, poring over microfilm archives, searching for any articles from February 1975 that might mention the discovery along the Rocky River. Maybe a forgotten news story would fill in the gaps. But what she found was even more disturbing than silence. Almost nothing. A young woman had been murdered, her remains found by children, and it had barely made the news. Back in 1975, the case was treated like just another Jane Doe, another unidentified woman whose death didn't attract much attention. Because there was no media coverage, no one in the public even knew it had happened. That meant no tips, no pressure on investigators, and no momentum to solve it. The young woman was forgotten by the press just as thoroughly as she had been forgotten by the system. When Christina started digging into the case, she began calling every police department she could think of: Cleveland, Akron, the Cuyahoga County Sheriff's Office. But everywhere she turned, she hit a wall. Some departments had no records at all. Others had files, but they were incomplete or poorly archived. Most of them told her that information on cold cases wasn't public, and if she wanted access, she'd need to file formal requests that could take weeks or even months. It was frustrating. In the digital age, Christina had gotten used to finding answers quickly, but this decades-old murder was still trapped behind layers of red tape. She started to realize why so many cold cases stayed cold. Not just because they were hard to solve, but because bureaucracy made it almost impossible to even try. The system wasn't built for people to ask questions. Then she caught her first real break. Lieutenant Don Silvis from the Cleveland Metroparks Police was different. When Christina explained what she was doing, her connection to the area, her concern for the unidentified victim, and her background in genealogy, he listened. He saw something in her that others didn't. Genuine care, real skill, and a determination to help someone who'd been forgotten. So, Silvis did something unexpected. He gave Christina access to the original case files, crime scene photos, forensic reports, investigator notes, documents that hadn't been seen in decades. Normally, that kind of information isn't shared with civilians. But Silvis saw potential. If Christina's research and her online network could breathe new life into this cold case, then maybe it was worth the risk. And those files changed everything. The photos were haunting. Pictures of the muddy skull discovered by the boys, images of the bullet wound in her temple, and records of the bones scattered in the woods. Suddenly, this wasn't just a line in a cemetery log. It was a real woman, someone who had been brutally murdered and forgotten. And Christina was now holding the evidence in her hands. She kept working on the case on her own for a while, but eventually she hit a wall. She needed help. She needed more eyes, more ideas, the kind of teamwork that only a large community could offer. That's when she turned to Reddit. She chose a subreddit, r/Unresolved Mysteries, a group with over 400,000 members focused on cold cases and missing persons. Using the username CallMice, Christina shared everything. The cemetery entry that started all, the police files, the photos, and her belief that this woman had fallen through the cracks. And the response was immediate. People on Reddit were shocked, not because it was another murder case, but because it seemed impossible that a victim could simply vanish from all records, with no name, no family, no trace. These weren't just casual readers. They were deeply engaged. They were angry that something like this could happen, and they were ready to help. This case became a symbol of everything that can go wrong in cold case investigations. Confusion between police departments, lost or incomplete records, poor communication, and the system's tendency to dismiss families searching for missing loved ones. But once Christina shared it, online users quickly stepped up. Some began cross-referencing the Strongsville discovery with missing persons databases from the 1970s. Others used advanced search techniques to comb through old newspapers, hoping to find mentions Christina might have missed. They explored digital archives, genealogy databases, military records, and the Social Security Death Index. The community was now casting a research net far wider than any one person ever could. Soon, the case spread beyond Reddit. With Christina's permission, a user named Migmu shared her findings on websleuths.com, a well-known platform dedicated to missing persons cases. WebSleuths had over 115,000 members, 12 million posts, and a history of real-world success, including helping match over 20 unidentified bodies with missing people. It was exactly the kind of crowd Christina needed. The platform was full of experts, retired police officers, genealogy pros, former military investigators, and dedicated amateurs with deep knowledge of old cases. And once the Strongsville Jane Doe case appeared there, it triggered a full-scale effort. People knew how to handle this kind of mystery. Christina had unintentionally sparked a perfect storm, a storm of collective intelligence and digital determination. Reddit and WebSleuths users began working together, sharing leads, building theories, splitting research tasks, and cross-posting discoveries. Some focused on hunting through 1970s news articles. Others built detailed family trees, hoping to find a DNA match. Some reached out to professionals in law enforcement or forensic science. Together, they created a kind of investigative force that traditional police departments simply couldn't match. While detectives had dozens of cases on their desks and bureaucratic limits to work within, these internet sleuths had just one mission, and no borders. Christina watched in awe as what started as a quiet, personal project turned into a national collaboration. Dozens of strangers had joined her mission to give back a name and a story to a woman the world had forgotten. Meanwhile, across the country in California, a 54-year-old former accountant named Carl Koppelman stumbled across the same online forums, now buzzing with updates about Strongsville Jane Doe. He wasn't your typical forum user. Carl had found a very specific and remarkable calling, creating facial reconstructions of unidentified human remains. It all began after he retired from his job as a CPA. He started following missing persons cases online, driven by curiosity and compassion. But unlike most people, Carl had both an analytical mind and natural artistic talent. So he decided to try something bold, teaching himself how to create digital facial reconstructions using anatomy books, forensic guides, and software. He studied intensely, completely self-taught. What began as a hobby became a life-changing mission. Carl had already helped solve major cases, including identifying Tammy Jo Alexander, who had been known for decades as Caledonia Jane Doe. His process was a mix of science and art, using skull measurements, facial tissue depth markers, and anatomy to recreate what a victim may have looked like in life. These images could trigger memories in family members or friends, memories that could lead to real identifications. So when Carl saw Christina's work, he didn't just scroll past it. He was intrigued, deeply. At first, Carl Koppelman wasn't sure he could help. When he saw the photos Christina had shared, he was skeptical. The skull was covered in mud, whether from months of exposure, and damaged by time and animals. Important facial features were missing entirely. In his own words, Carl said, "I looked at it for a couple of months and thought, no, the angles are wrong. There's no mandible, no hair color. The front teeth are gone. There's nothing I can do with this." And for forensic artists, these weren't small issues. They were major roadblocks. The mandible, or lower jaw, shapes the face and jawline. Hair color affects how people remember someone. Teeth play a role in lip shape and facial balance. Without these details, Carl was being asked to recreate a human face from fragments, to give identity and dignity to someone whose most personal features had been lost. The challenge was enormous. For months, the photos just sat in Carl's files, a silent reminder of a puzzle he couldn't solve. But something about this case wouldn't let go of him. Maybe it was Christina's determination, documented in post after post. Maybe it was the injustice of a woman remaining nameless for over 40 years. Or maybe Carl just knew that if he didn't try, no one else would. Eventually, Carl made a decision. As he put it, "What the hell? I'll give it a shot." And thank God he did. Using advanced 3D modeling software, the kind used by forensic anthropologists, Carl began the painstaking process of rebuilding a face. He studied every angle of the skull, taking detailed measurements and identifying key landmarks. Then, using data from the FBI on facial tissue thickness, he estimated how muscle and skin would have sat on the bones. The missing mandible required educated guesswork. Carl compared the skull to similar cases, reviewed anatomical guides, and made careful estimates about jaw shape and placement. As for the teeth, there were only 5 left. He reconstructed lip structure based on what remained. With no DNA to indicate hair color or texture, he chose a neutral brown that wouldn't mislead or exclude potential recognition. This wasn't just technical work. It was art. And slowly, Carl began to bring a face to life. Not a lifeless diagram, but a real person. A young woman with gentle features, soft eyes, and a kind expression. She looked like someone you might know, a daughter, a sister, a friend. For the first time in over 4 decades, the Strongsville Jane Doe had a face. But even that wasn't enough. The next challenge was getting her face in front of the right people, investigators, and family members who might recognize her. That's where Christina's online community became crucial. Reddit web sleuths and other platforms helped spread Carl's reconstruction far and wide. Thousands of people saw the image. Some were captivated, some were heartbroken, and some might have known something. Still, the case might have remained stuck online if not for a twist of fate, a completely unrelated phone call. In 2016, Carl was working on a different case. He needed to contact the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's office about unrelated remains. During the conversation, he casually mentioned the Strongsville case and the facial reconstruction he had created, and how no one seemed to be doing anything about it. But then came a shocking reply. "Which bones?" the person on the other end asked. The office had no record at all of the Strongsville Jane Doe. This wasn't just a small mistake. It wasn't a lost file or a report misfiled in some back room. The Strongsville Jane Doe case had never even been entered into NAMUS, the National Missing and Unidentified Person System. This is the main national database used to connect unidentified remains with missing persons reports across the U.S. That revelation was staggering. For over a decade, NAMUS had been helping investigators solve cold cases by matching the missing with the unknown. It was designed specifically to prevent tragedies like Strongsville Jane Doe from slipping through the cracks. But all that only worked if the case had been entered into the system in the first place. In this case, it hadn't. It likely came down to something as simple as a clerical error, a spelling mistake, a jurisdiction mix-up, or paperwork that never got processed in the 1970s. But that tiny mistake had one devastating result. This murder victim was excluded from the very tools meant to identify her. And that mistake didn't just affect her case. It raised a terrifying question. How many other victims had vanished from the system the same way? How many families were still searching, unaware their loved one's case was never even filed correctly? Once the error was discovered, fixing it was straightforward. The Strongsville Jane Doe case was officially added to NAMUS, this time with all the forensic details gathered over decades, plus Carl Koppelman's facial reconstruction. For the first time since 1975, she was no longer invisible to the system designed to find her, and the impact was almost immediate. In December 2016, Sergeant Jeff Smith of the Akron Police Department was running routine searches through NAMUS. He came across the newly added Strongsville case. The estimated age, the time frame, the location. Something clicked. He began cross-referencing missing persons reports from the same period. That's when he found her. A missing persons report filed in September 1974, just a few months before the Strongsville discovery. It was for a 17-year-old girl who had vanished from Akron. The timeline matched. The distance made sense. The age estimate fit. But what convinced Sergeant Smith most was the face. When he pulled up the missing person photo and compared it to Carl Koppelman's digital reconstruction, the resemblance was striking. Uncanny. Carl's reaction when he saw the photo was immediate. "She looked like my drawing," he said. After all the years this case had languished in silence, and after all the effort poured into bringing a face to life from near unusable remains, the moment had finally come. The Strongsville Jane Doe had a name, Linda Marie Pagano. But finding a possible match was only step one. Proving it scientifically would take months of effort, legal approvals, and forensic precision. This wasn't just an ID. This was a resurrection. For Linda, for her family, for justice. The first step was comparing dental records. Linda's 1974 file had detailed dental charts from regular checkups. Investigators compared them to what remained from a 1975 remains: 5 teeth and a partially developed wisdom tooth. There were promising similarities, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. To be certain, they needed DNA. That meant exhuming remains that had been buried for over 40 years in an unmarked grave. In October 2017, with a court order in hand, investigators returned to Memorial Garden Cemetery. They brought in ground-penetrating radar from the University of Akron to scan Potter's Field, the area where unidentified and unclaimed bodies had been buried. Dozens of unmarked graves, minimal documentation, no maps. It was hard. Their first attempt failed. They dug up the wrong remains. Just one more painful reminder of how easily the forgotten can vanish, even in death. But after several tries and careful surveying, they finally found the right grave. They exhumed the woman once buried as unknown white female, bones. Samples were taken and sent to the University of North Texas DNA lab for testing. The lab conducted mitochondrial DNA analysis, perfect for degraded remains and especially effective for sibling comparison. It works by using DNA passed down to the maternal line, offering a stable genetic fingerprint across generations. While science worked in the background, investigators started piecing together who Linda Marie Pagano had been in life. Born April 11, 1957, Linda was the youngest of 3 children. Her friends and family called her Mitch, a nickname referencing her small frame. It may sound odd today, but back then it was a playful term of affection, not meant to offend. Linda Pagano may have been small, just 4 feet 10 inches and around 100 pounds, but those who knew her said she had a big spirit. She was described as honest, hardworking, and surprisingly independent for a teenager. Her blonde hair and bright blue eyes gave her a mischievous sparkle, and though she was naturally shy, she was well-liked by her classmates at Springfield High School in Akron, Ohio. She worked part-time at the local A&W restaurant in Talmadge, saving her earnings for the future. Linda was the kind of teen who followed the rules, stayed out of trouble, and quietly dreamed of something more than what her small town had to offer. What investigators later discovered about her final night alive was both beautiful and tragic. On August 31st, 1974, Linda had tickets to see her favorite band, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, live at Cleveland Stadium. It was one of the biggest concerts of the year. 26 songs, 2 encores, and a crowd of 80,000 fans. Linda was there in her gold Mustang, the car she had proudly saved up for, accompanied by her boyfriend Steve Wilson and a few close friends. One friend would later say that Linda seemed on top of the world that night. The concert ended after 11 p.m., and the group still had to navigate traffic, drop off friends, and make the long drive back to Akron. Linda didn't get home until around 4 a.m. on September 1st. Waiting for her was her stepfather, Byron Claflin, a bartender with a known drinking problem and a violent temper. He had been drinking that night, fuming over Linda's late return. Their relationship had always been tense, but now that Linda was nearing 18 and becoming more independent, their clashes had become worse. To Claflin, Linda's growing confidence looked like defiance. That early morning, the two argued, loudly and intensely, and in a fit of rage, Claflin threw her out of the apartment, shouting that she should never come back. Those were the last words anyone would ever officially hear Linda Pagano say. She was reported missing the next day, on September 2nd, 1974. Linda had no place to go. No one knew where she might have gone. She had little money, only what was in her purse, and very few options. In 1974, there were no cell phones, no social media, and no digital trail. She had simply vanished. Despite her family's desperate efforts, Linda remained missing for 44 years. Her stepfather, Byron Claflin, was always a person of interest, but he was never charged. He died in 1990, taking whatever he knew about that night to the grave. Investigators always believed that Linda's disappearance was directly connected to their final argument. But without a body, without evidence, and without witnesses, there was nothing to prove in court. Flash forward to 2017. DNA testing was now underway on the exhumed Strongsville remains. Scientists use mitochondrial DNA, which is especially useful in cases involving old or degraded samples. This type of DNA is passed down from mothers to children and is more stable than nuclear DNA. It's perfect for comparing genetic material between siblings, but it comes with a limitation. Mitochondrial DNA can only confirm a maternal relationship. A positive match doesn't prove identity, just that the remains belong to someone related to Linda through her maternal line. A non-match, however, would definitively rule her out. In Linda's case, the test was a match. And even though the DNA result alone wasn't conclusive proof, everything else lined up: the age, the height, the time of death, the location. When taken together with Carl Koppelman's facial reconstruction, which had led police to this match in the first place, investigators finally had scientific confirmation. On June 29, 2018, after 44 years of silence and uncertainty, the DNA results from the University of North Texas finally gave a definitive answer. The remains discovered by 3 teenage boys along Rocky River in 1975 were those of Linda Marie Pagano. The girl who vanished after being thrown out of her home for coming back late had finally been found. When Christina Skates received a call confirming the news, she was at home, casually gaming, never expecting that this moment, years in the making, would arrive so suddenly. As she later put it, "I got choked up when I got the news." I mean, to think that a simple hobby, just try to find a name that was erased by bureaucratic mess, actually helped solve a murder, it's just amazing. It's surreal. That cemetery ledger line, "Unknown white female bones," that haunted her for months had finally been answered. Linda now had a name, a family, and people who never stopped loving her. On July 12, 2018, the discovery was officially announced during a press conference, bringing closure to one of Ohio's longest-running Jane Doe cases. Linda Marie Pagano was no longer a mystery. She was a victim of homicide, a young woman who had finally been given back her identity and her dignity. With that, the case was reopened as an active homicide investigation under the Cleveland Metroparks Police. For Michael Pagano, Linda's brother, the news was overwhelming. Back in 1975, when the remains were first found, Michael had called the police and asked if they could be his sisters. But the authorities brushed him off. "Nah," they said, "it doesn't sound right." The case was shelved and forgotten. Decades later, when the truth finally came out, Michael said, "I thought I was in a dream. I thought I'd never see this day. I thought I would die never knowing. I'm amazed it came to light like this." He made a point to meet Christina Skates in person, to thank her for doing what the official system had failed to do for nearly half a century. 2 strangers, bound by tragedy and determination, face to face. A powerful reminder that sometimes justice doesn't begin with institutions. It begins with individuals who refuse to look away. In January 2019, Linda Marie Pagano was finally laid to rest with the respect she had been denied for 44 years. Her remains were cremated and buried next to her mother in Holy Cross Cemetery. She had made the journey from an anonymous grave in Potter's Field to a resting place surrounded by family who never gave up on her. But even with her identity restored, the case was far from over. Now, investigators faced a harder challenge: proving who killed Linda. When the case reopened in 2018, detectives inherited a homicide nearly half a century old, with decayed evidence, lost records, and potential witnesses who had either died or disappeared. The prime suspect had always been Byron Claflin, Linda's stepfather. He was the last known person to see her alive, the one who had thrown her out of the house after their final argument in the early hours of September 1st, 1974. The circumstances were deeply troubling. A 17-year-old girl with no money, no place to go, kicked out into the night by a man with a history of drinking and aggression. But Claflin had died in 1990, nearly 30 years earlier. If he knew what happened to Linda, he took that truth to the grave. Even if investigators had built a case against him, there would be no arrest, no trial, and no formal admission of guilt. The other key person and potential witness was Linda's boyfriend, Steve Wilson. He had gone to the concert with her that night. He had likely driven her home. He could have filled in the missing pieces of her final hours. But by 2018, Steve Wilson had vanished from all official records. After decades of cold leads, investigators couldn't even confirm if he was still alive. Without testimony, key details about Linda Pagano's final hours may never be known. For her brother Michael, who waited 44 years for answers, that reality was both relieving and heartbreaking. The family finally knew what happened to Linda, but legal accountability would never come. As Michael said with quiet resignation, "We'll know in our hearts who did it, but we'll never be able to prove it." Linda's case highlights not only the emotional toll of cold cases, but also the systemic problems that continue to plague them. Evidence fades. Witnesses die or vanish. Suspects avoid justice simply by outliving it. But Linda's story also revealed failures deeper than time alone. Failures of the system itself. The fact that a simple clerical error kept Linda's remains out of NAMUS, the national database designed specifically to prevent unidentified victims from being forgotten, raises serious questions. How many other victims have slipped through the cracks because of a typo, a missing file, or a jurisdictional mix-up? NAMUS has existed since 2009, and yet, as of 2016, thousands of older cases had still not been entered into the system. If a young girl like Linda could vanish from official records because of one oversight, how many others are buried in unmarked graves, not because their cases are unsolvable, but because no one ever properly filed them? After Linda's discovery, this failure sparked a ripple effect. Audits began across Ohio and other states. Investigators uncovered hundreds of forgotten cases, Jane and John Does from the 1970s and 1980s. Not loss of mystery, but to poor record-keeping. Linda's case exposed how easily critical information can be lost when agencies fail to communicate. Akron police, who had taken the original missing person report, apparently never received proper notification when the remains were found in Strongsville, just 20 miles away. In the pre-digital age, those 20 miles might as well have been 2,000. It ended up taking a volunteer forensic artist, Carl Koppelman, working from a home computer, to give Linda her face back. Software that once cost thousands was now freely available. Tutorials, public databases, digital archives, the tools were there, but the real difference came from people willing to use them. Linda's case showed the transformative power of technology and human collaboration. Christina Skates didn't have a badge. She wasn't a detective. She was just a student with curiosity, persistence, and an internet connection. She had no official training, but she had heart, and she had tools that connected her to thousands of like-minded people around the world. And that's what made the difference. Reddit web sleuths and other online communities became force multipliers for justice. The collective intelligence of hundreds of volunteers, each researching, cross-referencing, and digging, created an investigative power that even the best-funded departments couldn't match. And Christina's work became a model for responsible citizen investigation. She was careful, respectful, and thorough. She verified her information before posting. She never sensationalized. And in doing so, she inspired others to take on similar cases, always with the same discipline, care, and commitment to truth. Eventually, even law enforcement began to recognize the value of these digital detectives. Instead of seeing them as meddlers, they saw them as allies, a network of volunteer researchers helping overwhelmed cold case units find new paths forward. For Christina, solving Linda's case wasn't about glory. When asked about it, she simply said, "I was perfectly fine just bringing attention back to the case." She never sought fame. All she ever wanted was for a forgotten young woman to finally be seen. What began as one line, "Unknown white female, bones," became Linda Marie Pagano, a name, a life, a voice. She was 17. She had blonde hair and blue eyes. She worked at A&W. She saved money to buy a gold Mustang. Her friends called her Midge. And on the last night of her life, she danced and sang along with Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, feeling like the world was finally hers. And then she vanished. But thanks to Christina, Carl, and a vast community of strangers who refused to let her stay forgotten, Linda was brought home. Her face, her name, and her memory were restored. She wasn't just a Jane Doe anymore. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone who mattered. And today, as you listen to the story, somewhere out there, other families are still searching. Other victims are still waiting. In files, in unmarked graves, in dusty police boxes, waiting for someone with a laptop, a question, and a refusal to give up, because every person deserves to be named. Every person deserves to be found. And every person deserves to come home.
Thanks for watching, my little crime cookies. Don't forget to like, share, and smash that subscribe button. See you next time. Mwah.